Hi everybody, I'm Taluka from Markers and Minions, and tonight I want to go over the Unit 2 big ideas around character. So I just finished up my Unit 1 planning for all of the different grade levels, and I realized I know that many of us are still in Unit 1, doing Unit 1, and struggling in Unit 1. So I wanted to just sort of um, introduce Unit 2 just to get our feet a little bit wet. And then next week, I'll go into Unit 2 planning for grades 2 and up. And then the week after, I will do K1 planning for Unit 2. But tonight will be more of a general video across all grade levels. I'll go over my anchor chart, what I use with my third graders, and you'll be able to use a lot of the same things that I've put in my chart, and you'll be able to just adapt it for your grade level because the unit theme is so similar across the grade levels. And I'll go into how I use that anchor chart each week with the text and how I kind of bring the anchor chart back into my teaching. We revisit and reapply these ideas. And then I will go into, I printed out a bunch of pictures to keep me on track. I'll go into how I basically make it a little bit more fun and interactive. I'm really big on having the kids get up and move and talk and work together. And it doesn't need to be fancy. It doesn't need to be something that you need to go buy. Most of the time, it's just using your big ideas that you've taught whole class and then saying, here, apply this in a smaller scale with the team. So I'll talk about the ways that I've done that. And then Unit 2, I also was, a couple years ago, when I was teaching Unit 2, my second year of benchmark, I was being evaluated that year, and I'll show you what I did for my evaluation, so like how I jazzed up my lesson. And then I'll go over a couple of ideas for like incorporating art, and I even did like a research project. So just fun ways to really enhance this unit. People love Unit 2. Sometimes people start with Unit 2, and if you are going in order and you started with Unit 1, you'll realize and you'll find that once you start Unit 2, you'll all be able to like just take a nice big deep breath because it's so fun. It's all around characters, it's fictional text, and it's just a lot lighter in terms of content and ideas compared to Unit 1. So it'll be a nice like breath of fresh air. Okay. So here we go. First of all, my anchor chart. I use this year after year. Hey, Gail. Year after year, I don't need to modify it. It's the best. I love it. I was being GLAD trained the year that we adopted Benchmark, maybe the year prior. It was around the same time. And so I found ways to GLADify all my units. So a lot of what I'm doing and what I'm showing today is our strategies that I picked up from my Orange County Department of Ed Project GLAD training. And it has nothing to do with Benchmark, it's its own thing. I'll link their website. If you're not GLAD trained, definitely look into it. It's the best training I've ever had as a teacher, that and Kagan. And I bring that into my teaching like whenever I can. So I made this chart around the same time as I was being GLAD trained. And yeah, I use it every year for Unit 2. So here's what it looks like. Now, Unit 2 is all about characters. So, and that's across the grade levels. In kindergarten, you're going to be going over, actually, let me overview the grade levels real quick. In kindergarten, you're going to be introducing what a character is and basically like kindergarten first, setting and parts of a story, what makes a story, the role of a character in a story. And then from there, once we get to second grade, this element of the challenge is introduced, and we know that like evolves into conflict and plot. So in second and third, it really focuses on the challenges that characters face and the way that they react and respond to those challenges. Okay, and then that idea just evolves, builds upon those same ideas in the upper grade levels. All right, so you'll be able to use a ton of these ideas. Now, I put character in the middle here, and I just left it ambiguous because you'll see whenever we read a new or read a new text in Unit 2, this like being right here will become the character in the text that you're reading about. So I just kind of leave it in like general, and we talk about, well, what is a character? How do we describe our characters? Well, we use something called traits, and traits are also known as like the adjectives or describing words. And they help us get to know our character. And basically, that's going to be the gist in K1. That's going to be the gist of your whole unit. Like, what is a character? Why do we have them? Basically. All right. And then from there, I kind of go into this like cycle here, and then these just float off to the side. I teach it in this order. So after we go over what a character is, I go into motives and what motives are. Now, I talk about like how characters have a why behind everything they do, and it's the reasons for their actions. And then here's where I also bring in that like sometimes the characters don't tell you what their motives are, and you need to figure out what motivates them, and you need to kind of infer, okay? Because in the upper grades, you're gonna be doing that a lot more. So that kind of introduces the kids to this idea of like, well, it's not always explicit. We don't always know exactly who our characters are right away. It's not just going to tell us all the time, their traits. You have to kind of read about them, read about like their motivations and their actions, and then make inferences about them. So then I talk about like how the motives directly relate to the actions that happen in the story. So the key events, right? So then we talk about like how actions are the verbs, the things that our characters do. And then I also point out that these can also be the decisions that they make. And then from there, I say, okay, we have this idea around what they're doing and the decisions. What does that look like afterwards? And then I introduce this concept of consequences, or you can say reactions, depending on your grade level. And I'll say, this is what happens as a result. And it's a nice little connection to those of us who taught cause and effect in Unit 1. So it's the result, it's what comes afterwards. And then I talk about how this can be good and it can be bad. A consequence isn't always bad. It's just what happens later as a result. And so that's where I am at so far. So we really just talk about how characters, this makes up every single story. Like characters are always going to have their motivations, and they're going to do things, and there are going to be consequences for the things that they do. And that's basically essentially what a story is and why stories are so interesting. And then I talk about this idea of challenge. And I say, well, characters go through problems or conflict in their day-to-day lives and in their stories. So I'll say that the character can be going through something that's good, can be going through something that's bad. When you think of problem, you think bad, right? But I also try to point out that like it can be a good conflict. It can be maybe a quest or an adventure or something like that. So it's not always like a really bad problem that this character is going through. And then I talk about how a challenge, when you identify what that challenge is, you can then see how the character grows and how they change throughout the story and how they approach and deal with that challenge. And then that becomes the storyline, right? And I talk about how that is what tells the story. When they're going through something, they're learning and they're growing, that is advancing the story and moving the plot forward. Okay, if you're upper elementary, you can talk about like the rise and the fall. And then I talk about lessons. So I'll say, and by the way, I think in all the grade levels, double check, but I think in pretty much all the grade levels, you're reading either a fable or a fairy tale, a folk tale, a quest. You're reading a text that has some sort of lesson or moral at the end. So I like to tie that in there as well. And I'll say, this is like the solution to the problem. It can be what the character learned. It can be also known as like the moral or the central message. And I try to introduce the idea of central message, which is the RL.2 standard. In second grade, that's like that kind of morphs from first to second. The focus becomes determining the central message. So I just want to make sure that that vocabulary is in there and how that's very similar to our moral in our lesson. And then I'll say our story ends with some sort of change in the end. So there's a resolution, okay? So it ends up being different in the end. So I do this in the beginning before we go into any of our texts. And I actually have a video of me teaching this to my kids, my third graders, and I will link it afterwards. It's on YouTube. And I go through, it's 11 minutes long, so this can be done in 11 minutes. And I go through each of these examples using Moana, because I've only seen Moana like 2,000 times in my house. So I use that, and we talk about her character and her challenge. And you'll see the pacing and where I have the kids turn and talk and kind of process and digest. And it becomes a really nice introduction. Now from there, we start reading our weekly text, and then we start taking these categories, like these big ideas, and applying it to the specific stories that we read about. So here's a picture of one of the third grade texts. So now we don't have this ambiguous character in the middle. I actually traced from the student text, I projected it and traced the characters of Ivan and Marie. And this is a Russian folktale for Snow White. And look, same categories here. So we start by describing our characters here with their character traits, their adjectives. And if you notice, also same colors too. So the kids it's very visual. So purple. Then I go into what motivates them. And by the way, if you do this, you're doing the key events lesson, and you're doing it differently. So I know that lesson kind of gets repetitive after a while. The key details, main idea, key events, summary, central message. It's a way to stop or get out of the text and like do it in a different way. You don't always have to be annotating and following that same sequence or that same structure for all those lessons. This accomplishes the same thing. So same objective. So we pull out their motives and basically connect that to the actions, like what do they do? And then the reactions, the consequences of what they did. Hey, guess what? This is also sequencing. So many skills all together. And then we talk about the challenges that they face and then the solutions. And I actually pointed out here is like there's not really a solution the way we like to think of solutions. Like it's a sad ending in this story in particular. So I just say like this is just how it ends. This is how it culminates. So you can do this with any of the stories that you read, any of the texts. So like in fourth grade, you're going to be reading Wizard of Oz. Same thing. Peter Pan. Same thing. You can take them through the sequence. Another lesson that's going to be carried out in a lot of the different grade levels is this idea of comparing the characters that you read about. So it's that 0.9, I want to say. I think it falls under 0.9. Might be under 0.3, the analyzed character standards. I haven't looked at it in a while, so don't quote me on that. But it's the standard or the scale where they're taking two characters or two texts and they're integrating them, analyzing them. So this is another chart that I did for that. And this is also a Project GLAD chart, inspired chart, where you could also do a Venn diagram, honestly, where you're comparing and contrasting. So these were two different characters from two different texts. And we took those same categories and we compared them. So this took place of, I want to say, lesson 14. Instead of just annotating in our text, filling out a graphic organizer, which isn't bad. Like you can still have the kids do that afterwards as a follow-up. But this is a nice way to switch it up a little bit. So we use the same colors, and then you'll notice some things are circled in black. Those are what were in common. Those were some of the similarities. And then in the middle here, I wrote the final moral of each story. Okay, so it's pretty visual. You can see how they're different, but you can also see what overlaps. Okay. Man, the sun is setting right on me, so sorry, guys. This was an activity I did with my students where they were actually in their teams. So in Unit 2, we're really focusing also in my class, we're focusing on implementing those teams and those small groups and the group work and how we work together collaboratively. Because I am one of those teachers where I do like kids to not just be working on their independent tasks at their seats. I like them to be in groups and talking and working through things together. So what I do is I basically recreate the chart, but on the giant sticky notes. So this is like on butcher paper, but like the big Post-it notes, I'll just give one of those to each student, and I just prep this, and each team. I hand one of these to each team. So one of the texts that we read about is King Midas. I want to say it's like the second week's text. So I just drew him in the middle, and all I did was I put the category headings here. So then students in their teams had to pull out all of these key events, all of these analyzing character pieces from the text, and fill this out. And then I shared a couple, maybe last week, whenever I have kids working together in their teams, and this is another Project Glad strategy, they have their own color when they're working. So I have them make a little key. So like purple is Toluca, whatever. And they make a little legend or key here for me. And then I can see exactly who's contributing. So if there's not enough purple, I need to go talk to Toluca and say, hey, you need to participate a little more. Or hey, I need to check in with Toluca. This might have been tricky for her. All right. So that's another way to, if you notice, this is me, I do. This is us, we do. And this is you do. Aha! Okay, so that's how I use the anchor chart throughout the unit. Now, a couple of other pictures here I want to show you. I mentioned that I was evaluated, and so I wanted to really jazz up one of my lessons. And I found that another big idea in Unit 2, not just characters, another big idea is around, in third grade anyway, like sensory details and feelings. And you'll notice that there's this big overarching theme of characters, but there's going to also be these underlying themes and these other lessons that you're going to be teaching each week. So those are also essential, and you do want to weave those in somehow too. So what I did was we took the Ballad of John Henry, and our close reading purpose for that day was to analyze sensory details. So I talked about like how it's a poem, and we talked about features of a poem, and there's imagery, and I went over our 5 senses here. And here you can see I did one by myself. I pulled out text evidence from our poem, and I lifted it, and I said, this is an example of something that we could almost see when we read it. So for example, it says, till his hammer was striking fire. So in my mind's eye, when I read that line, I can see the hammer and I can see the spark. I can see the fire. So then I talk about, well, what other senses? When you hear that line, what other senses does that appeal to? And the kids say, oh, like the smell of the fire, okay. The feeling of that heavy hammer and banging it against the mountain, okay. And the sound of that. So then we talk about how each line in this poem really has a ton of examples of these like sensory imagery that they create. So I have them work together with a partner. I had them work together with a partner with a Post-it note, and I said, find me an example from the text and then come on up and put it underneath the sentence. So my students were working together during that lesson. They were annotating their text first to find the examples, and then they transferred that onto a Post-it note, and then they came up and they demonstrated their learning. Okay. So that's another way that I enhance some of these lessons. Whenever I have the opportunity to make a chart, I will always make a chart. Okay, now I also do my artist study alongside Unit 2. And the reason why is because through analyzing character, I try to emphasize that we're talking about people and who they are and what they see and what they feel. And then I try to put that on them as well. And I say, like, well, what kind of character are you? What are your feelings? What motivates you in your life? And what motivates what sorts of actions? Well, what makes you you, basically. So it's a way for the kids to self-reflect. And then I also go into like Frida Kahlo, because she's my favorite, and I teach her every year, even before benchmark. And we talk about Frida Kahlo's, character, her persona, and some of her life experiences, and then we analyze a piece of her art together. And you can honestly bring in any artist you love, and it doesn't need to be this insane high level analysis. You can do it with even your kinders, like, well, what do you notice in this painting? Why do you think she painted that? So things like that, motives, right? And then I say, okay, well, now you understand a little bit of Frida Kahlo's mind and how she expressed her feelings. I want you to imagine and put yourself into her character now and look at yourself through her eyes. So my third graders can do this, by the way. I do this every year and call it Through the Eyes of Frida Kahlo. And the kids have to paint themselves as Frida would see them. Okay, so we do self-portraits, and this is where we talk about how, like, the girls typically like to draw themselves. Usually when they do self-portraits, they put like makeup on and like the red right here, and I talk about, like, well, Frida, how would she paint you that way? And I don't. It's a deep lesson, and we really go into analyzing ourselves and yeah, just who we are and why we act the way that we do, and who, not just who we are, but like at our core, like what's important to us. So that's another big extension that I like to do, and it makes a really beautiful display that can stay up for a long time, really the whole year if you'd like. I always like to have my students' self-portraits hanging in our classroom. Okay, and then lastly, one other project that I do are historical buddy, like Pokemon-inspired trading cards. So I initially got this idea from the back of the TRS under additional resources. There are a ton of projects there. Well, a ton. There's like 3 or 4 usually for each unit. And I took the idea from there and I created like these little cards. And then I kind of went back to Unit 1 in a way, because I said, well, we read about all of these different people throughout government. Choose somebody, not necessarily government related, but just a historical figure, and talk about or research the challenges that they went through and what they did, so their actions, and the consequences of their actions. So we follow the same sequence, but we apply it to someone in history. And then the kids make little trading cards. And so on the back, they write like their bio. And my kids were really, the year that I designed this, my kids were really into Pokemon cards and like battling. So they came up with what the powers are. So it's a Pokemon reference, but let me think of one. Like a scientist, say, like if they were doing a famous scientist, one of their powers would be, like doing some sort of experiment, and they had to come up with a way to rank these people and based on their impact and the consequences of their actions. So it's a nice little way to extend that as well. You can see in this picture, this wasn't mine, this was in another class actually, where they were laying out all of their character cards and learning about each other's characters and battling them. So anyway, that's what I've got, guys. And I'm going to come through and read some of these comments and answer a few of them, but then I'm going to end this and answer the rest just typing, so that if anybody doesn't have time to watch this video, they can just go ahead and read through the comments and get an idea of what we talked about. Oh, Stephanie, congrats. Tomorrow she starts her GLAD training. Awesome. Chart paper, Melanie, I just get it from it's just a roll of butcher paper. So it's anchor chart paper, but it's not shiny. It's totally matte. It's just a big roll of blank white paper. All right. Hi, Jessica. Okay, guys, I'm actually going to sign off, and I'll be around next week. We'll talk about the planning for all 3 weeks. I'm going to focus on 4th grade because the Unit 1 video for 4th grade, as many of you know, disappeared into the internet somewhere. Facebook took it down. So I'm going to make it up to 4th grade teachers by planning Unit 2. If you're new to this group, the way that our Plan With Me videos work are, I have these free planning templates on my TPT shop. You print them out, you have them in front of you, and we do it together. And even if I'm planning like 4th grade, you can still follow the same like patterns and strategies and apply it to your own grade level, so you can totally follow along. They are divided by span though, so I've got the 2 through 6, 2nd grade through 6th grade. That will be one night, be next week. And then the following week, I'll do K1. And I don't know which grade level I'll specifically plan, but if you're a K or 1 teacher, you can tune in that night and follow along. Okay, guys, have a good night. Thank you.